Okay, hi everybody. This is Air, and let's see. Sorry, I had the wrong camera on. Okay, welcome to In Air's Kitchen. We decided to do some guests this week, and just like we had trouble the other week doing guests, I have a little technical difficulties I was working through. I think we've got it worked out though. So I thought we'd start out with an interview with Richard Bourdon. Richard is a baker at a really wonderful bakery in Western Massachusetts, and he's been doing this for a really long time. He's taught a lot of my favorite bakers and makes really beautiful bread. And I thought we'd talk to him a little bit about sourdough, and then afterwards, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about getting a starter made. So I'm going to switch over to that call right now. Okay. Well, all right, so I think everybody can hear you now, Richard, and hopefully they can hear me too. How are you doing?
Okay. I'm doing good, thanks. I'm doing good.
So, how are the
I'm
pigs?
the pigs are just great. I just made their new little house and they're in a new field and they're just the tails are wagging the right way. And so they'll be good in there for a couple of weeks and then in the meantime I'll clean up the other area they clean to prepare it for garden. I lost you there.
Oh, sorry. Hold on.
Did I lose
Can
you?
you? I can hear you. Can you hear
I
me?
lost you. Can you
Uh
hear
oh.
me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can you hear me? But I can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me? Again? Okay. Hold on.
Uh,
Can you hear me?
uh,
I can hear you fine.
no, I can't hear you.
No? All right. I'm gonna get back on
I
the
oh
things.
shit. Switch connect.
All right.
Leave.
How's that? I just tried to
Okay.
reconnect.
Oh,
Is it better?
are we back?
Yeah.
I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Same issue again. All right, I will
Technology.
try one more time. Yeah.
Switcher connected. Waited for another to join. Waiting for another to join. Okay.
Okay. So I
Okay.
disconnected and then I reconnected.
Okay.
Any luck? Does that sound good?
I hear you just fine right
Okay.
now. Yeah.
All right. All right. Sorry about that. Well, hopefully it will just.
Okay.
I'll leave everything be, and hopefully it'll work fine till the end of the interview. So,
Okay.
so people probably don't know you've got some new pigs that, and you've got a
That's right.
little, yeah. Um, so I wanted to. I told people who are watching. I think there are probably a lot of people watching who know who you are and know your bakery. And
Hmm.
for those of you who don't, I was thinking I could ask you just a couple questions about how you got started. When's the first time you ever remember making bread?
Well, I remember making bread just like you made bread this week in my little kitchen in Holland when I was, what, maybe 18. Kind of lining myself up in life, being curious about natural food. In those days, it was, anthroposophy or it was macrobiotics or it was, I always kind of wanted to be, how do you say that, like homesteader, like be able to do everything myself, not to depend on, to be stuck with relying on the industry or whatnot. Just curious to do stuff. I was curious about how did people ever do things before and how could we still do that. So we were making, sauerkraut and kimchi and things like that already then. And then I applied myself to baking. So I started in the little kitchen with spontaneous fermentation, just like you're gonna get going here with the folks and hopefully now we can coach in order to get results that are satisfactory and not necessarily the breaks that I did in the beginning.
So you had some failures early
uh,
on.
oh yeah, but we ate it all. It was all good food. We were just into it. So but as time went by we gotta perfection things and I actually, I was always interested in making sourdough bread. I was never really interested in making a yeasted bread, and because I knew that sourdough was the older way of making bread. It's actually that was just my pheasant you heard there. That was just the basically fermenting grains is as old as nature itself. It's nothing that we really discovered. It's something that's always been there. The only thing that we might have, learned, my guess is that we ate fermented grain in an instinctive fashion as well, because the bottom of it is that there's grains are technically not edible unless you do something to them. And the only two things you can do to grain is either to sprout them a little bit and then eat them, because the sprouted grain at the right period is just kind of the phase between becoming a plant or being a seed. It's in between, and there's a phase there where all the nutrients in it are made available in order to grow the plant. But if you consume it at that moment, then you get the best of everything. It's like something in the process, but it's actually, because a seed is basically everything is locked in there. It's actually not digestible, and even birds and chickens and even squirrels, they know how to sprout things. And I can only imagine that I don't know, whatever we were at 1.70 million years ago, maybe still instinctive before self awareness. I don't know. We had to eat, right? So I always question myself, well, what the hell did we eat before we even knew everything? We were there. And I guess we had to be in pretty good shape. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here because it's
Hmm.
just like those who are not good enough don't make it. So sprouting is the one way. And you often read, like Ezekiel or whatnot, some cultures that did a lot of sprouting grains, and that was a common thing. And the other way is to ferment it, to use a process of fermentation, and which also happens on its own. Because if a seed, for instance, fall in the right soil at the right temperature and everything, it'll sprout. But if it has the misfortune of falling in a puddle of water, it won't sprout. It's actually going to drown like anything else would drown. And when anything drowns or dies, well, nature sets in and bacteria then start to consume it. And in the process of consuming it, even though it's now dead and all plump and swollen, they actually also break down the anti-nutrients that make that these nutrients are locked in. And the main nutrient that we deal with seed, the main component that locks things up is phytates. So I don't know if you know. Most people know what phytates are now. It's also known as phytic acid. That's an acid that is PHYTIC. Phytic acid is an acid that binds minerals to itself, and the purpose of this acid in a seed is to prevent minerals from oxidizing until it starts to sprout. So the minerals are necessary to grow the plant, and then until that time, it's all locked up. So you could view a seed as a spaceship, if you will, that where everything is in it, the right amount, and then when they finally hit the right planet, then they can send down their little roots, and then they can start to grow again. So fermentation is the opposite, where something didn't make it, it drowned, for example, and then it turns plump, and then bacteria set in. And then if you eat it at that time, then it's also edible because the bacteria breaks down using lactic acid. They break down the phytates. So the phytates in grain is then hydrolyzed in water. So hydrolyzation, and then the minerals become available. And that's something that's been proven a long time ago. If you were to eat a lot of grains, whole grain in particular, without fermenting them or sprouting, you would actually, this phytic acid does not go away. It needs to be taken out. It needs to be broken down. And if you were to eat, like there have been cultures, let's say we ate a lot of grains without fermenting, you would end up with ricket. So you actually end up not absorbing the iron or the minerals that are present in the seed. So it really defeats the whole purpose. And like if you basically this phytic acid, how should I say that? Yeah, so you need to hydrolyze the phytic acid so the minerals then become available. And if you don't do that, then if you consume a lot of grains without doing that, you'll end up with something called ricket, like the bowed legs, like basically a shortage of iron. And so it's, with whole grains in particular, it's essential to do this. And and it's been done since ever. So all indigenous people actually, if you read Dr. Price, Weston A. Price, he's shown that indigenous people used to either sour grains before cooking it or after cooking it. So you can soak it in acidulated water and then cook it, or you can cook it and then let it sour and then eat it. So either way, pick pick
You
pick a
remind
one.
me. I remember I was at one point I was looking at old recipes from the 1800s when baking soda was first being used, and in a lot of those old recipes, they were published in newspapers and things. They said in the recipe, this is not as healthy a way. It's not as healthy, but if you're in a pinch, you can use this. So I think at
Um,
that point in time, people knew commonly that it wasn't as healthy a way to eat the flour, but it
well,
was a trade-off.
not as healthy as what,
I guess
or
that they're probably comparing that to something that's fermented. Maybe they're thinking about yeast, or maybe they're thinking about sourdough. I don't know.
oh, I don't know. Always
So
need
do
more
they do the
details.
yeast do the yeast do some of those same things that you were talking about, or no?
Well, yeah, no, commercial yeast as we know it, first of all, we should get clear that commercial yeast as we know it is only, about 200 years old. Before that, anything and everything was with sourdough. So, if you really want to make this clear, if Mary was hungry, let's say after giving birth to that holy child, right? And she would have asked Joseph to go get some bread down to the local Nazareth bakery. Well, it would have been sourdough bread. And any kind of bread, like even pita bread, anything with grains. Like a good example of ancient baking is actually injera bread. You're familiar with injera bread?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's from Ethiopia. That's got to be one of the oldest, and that's just basically teff flour and some wheat flour mixed together. They let it get sour, and then they make a little pancake out of it, and then they use it to grab their food with it. So, for you folks at home there, we're going to look into this as well. The simplest way is to just ferment grains and make yourself little pancakes and call it a day. And like you can make yourself a wrap, you don't need to worry about gluten. That could be done with any flour. Like teff is basically a gluten-free flour. What's important is the souring, and then so that's as far as fermentation, and anything beyond 200 years was all sourdough. So there was no option because yeast was only discovered since with the advent of the microscope, where they were able to select, by looking inside to see which creature in there was most gas producing. And then there's always yeast and bacteria are always together. It's just that yeast, that the bacteria are naturally more proliferate. Bacteria basically rule the world. They don't. Yeast are there, but they're kind of tolerated and they're allowed to be in, because bacteria, when they make the acidity, which serves the purpose of breaking down the phytates, it also serves the purpose of creating an environment that only they can live in. And that's where the yeast eventually will shy away.
So Richard, we're talking about history of baking. When did like refined white flour come into the mix? So yeast is only a couple hundred years. How about flour? When did we start changing the kind of flour we use?
Well, I don't know that for sure, but one thing I can tell you for sure is that in order to make white flour, you have to have some way of sifting it out. And sifting it out is, I don't know, if you go from Stone Age to Iron Age to living off of skins and weaving material and being able to make a fine mesh to be able to sift out things. I'm guessing, I don't know how old that might be. And, it could be, I don't know, it could be, but you'll often hear that it was for a special occasion or for the richer folks, and or to, I don't know those details really. All I know is that now all you have is white flour. So I can't hear you. Do you know that I
Oh,
can't hear
can
you?
you hear me now?
Okay,
All
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So
So
that would be worth. I'm sure someone in the audience might know that to do a little deeper. I'm sure it was
yeah.
there for a long time, but certainly not at at a high level, because if you hear stories of wanting white bread as perceived as more pure, more advanced, I don't know, that's all social stories to create that. The idea of having something lighter is kind of enticing. Humans kind of have a hard time being content with what they have. If you get a great drug, well, hey, what happens if we take a little more? Or if you mix it with this or that. So the idea of being content, and there's room for white flour. It's not that it's poison or anything. It's just that it's no nutrition. It's basically the endosperm, and the endosperm and the protein, and the endosperm is sugar. And so there's room for sugar. Like if you eat a piece of white bread with a nice bouillabaisse, for instance, or a nice stew that's rich in nutrients, well, then you'll survive. But
Hmm.
if you had to eat just on bread and water, I don't think it would go that well.
Yeah.
So basically there's room for white flour, but you got to keep it in its place. I understand that it's a refined food, that where the nutrients were depleted except for the endosperm, and so the sugar part. And you need sugar, you need energy that way, but you would be wise to make it part of a varied diet.
Yeah. Well, Richard,
Mm.
I want to thank you for the time. I'm gonna
Sure.
transition, and I'm gonna show people make a starter.
Okay.
Some of the things we've been doing together, and then we'll try and loop you in sometime later this week also for some
Okay.
more guidance. But thank you very very much. I
Hmm.
appreciate your time, and
hmm
thank you for chatting.
All right, that's great, and I'm sure you'll do well because you made some wonderful breads during the week that we worked together.
Yeah, some failures too, but that's all part of it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. But you're all folks. I just want to say you're in good hands. Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Bye.
Thank you, Ayer. Take care. Bye bye.
Okay. All right. So hi. I think we're back to me, and hopefully everything's still broadcasting fine. Somebody will send me a little text message if we're having any issues. So that was Richard, and Richard is a really really wonderful baker. If you get a chance to visit his bakery, maybe once we're back up in our normal lives, I would recommend it. It's a really beautiful drive out there in the summer, and his breads are really beautiful breads. And Richard likes a few things, which we were hearing from him a little bit. One is he likes a bread that's naturally leavened, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. He likes breads that have some whole grain in them, and actually a lot more than most people are baking today. And he's really really good at it. He makes really beautiful, really really delicious bread. Um, we're going to start making bread this week in earnest, but really, if you've been following along the show, you've already made bread. You may not know it, but we snuck it in some of the earlier episodes. So when we're talking about bread, there are, I would say, just three simple categories of it. One thing you may call a quick bread. So that, and people might be familiar with some of this, but I think it's easy. It's probably helpful to lay it all out. So a quick bread would be like a biscuit. This would be cornbread. So hopefully those things sound familiar. If you've been following along on the show, we've made those recipes already. Pancakes, which is something we're going to make in an upcoming episode, would be a quick bread. You may even consider the popovers in here. They're not quite a bread, maybe a little more of a pastry. And when we make bread, we're dealing with some form of gluten, and then we're dealing with some air that fills that, makes the little balloons, and that's what we think of as bread. So in this case, what's making these quick breads rise, or what's the leavener, is, in this case, it'd be baking soda. So we've talked about baking soda on the show a bunch of already. You could have baking powder, and we've talked a little bit about that and how that works. Or you could have eggs. Eggs were used a lot in a lot of different recipes to bring in lightness, and they're still used in some certain pancake recipes. They're still used in some cake recipes. So those are some of the big things that that we consider quick breads. So the next category, and you heard Richard talk a little bit about this, is considered yeasted bread. And so this category might consider most commercial breads, although it's funny, as I've learned more and more about breads, I found some breads are actually like they blow air into it because it's faster. But most commercial breads you're buying probably have yeast involved with creating the bubbles at some point. So I would just say sort of a loaf of bread is probably in this category. French bread would be in this category. Baguette would be here. And other kinds of breads, a brioche would be here. A round, bread would be there. Focaccia would be there. And in this case, the leavener is yeast. And there are a few different kinds of yeast, but that's, and as Richard was saying, this is only about 200 years old. So the quick is about 150 or so years old when people started doing these quick breads, with the exception of eggs. That's obviously a lot older. The yeast, commercial yeast, is about 200 years old or so. The third grouping we're going to have here is going to be, I'll just call these naturally leavened breads. And so these are the sourdoughs, they're often called. And these breads, so sourdough is going to be a very famous bread that people will be familiar with in this category, but also the breads that Richard makes. So, and these come in lots of different shapes and sizes. So we can have sourdough loaves, and we can have rounds and other different shapes of the bread. We can have pizza, and we're going to do that at the end of this week. When I was saying we've already made some bread, we've made some of these. We also made a couple of these. We made pizza last week. We made an overnight pizza, and the week before that we made a really quick pizza. Both of those used yeast. And down here we have, for the naturally leavened breads, we're going to have bacteria and yeast. So we're going to have both of those. And these are going to be a very complex population of these little critters. And they're living in harmony, and they're expanding and contracting in their population size as they eat up the yummy food that they're finding in the bread. So 3 different types of bread: quick bread, yeast bread, naturally leavened bread. The leavener, baking soda, baking powder, eggs would be up in those quick breads. Yeast would be for the yeasted breads, and naturally leavened. Of these breads, this is the one that takes the longest to make. This one's a little quicker. This one's definitely the quickest bread. The quick breads, usually you can make those biscuits in like 15 minutes or less. This reaction happens instantaneously. You combine the baking soda with the acid, and boom, you have bubbles. The yeast is a little bit slower, but still pretty quick. We made that very, very fast pizza, and we made that dough in like 20-30 minutes. The overnight one we took longer, so that took 24 hours. So this might vary in how long it takes. And this, I'll say, long, long time. The naturally leavened, first of all, we're going to make a starter, and that's going to take us 2 to 4 days, depending on what kind of flour we have. And then after we get the starter made, we're going to refresh it and get it ready to make some bread for us, and then we're going to make some bread. And so that's going to take another couple days. So this is a much longer process. So why would you want to do any of this? Well, we're gonna spend some time with all of these. And what I would hope is if you followed along with enough of these episodes, you're going to get comfortable in your own kitchen, get your hands dirty, playing around, and making all of these different kinds of breads. And I care. This is really not the show to watch if you're trying to recreate, a beautiful sourdough bread from a bakery in San Francisco. There's probably better ways to go about that. What I really want to do instead is get people excited to play around with their kids, with their family, with themselves. Like Richard said, a lot of those early loaves he made were like bricks, and don't be afraid. You might make something that doesn't turn out looking Instagram ready, but that's okay. We're going to make food that is really delicious, and you're going to be able to eat all of what comes out of it, and you're going to learn and have a lot of fun along the process. And we're also going to make something that's really nutritious. So that's what we're going to be getting to. And like Richard said, the white, you can make white or wheat breads with yeast. And yeast does it does change the nature of the whole wheat. But if you want to get the most nutritious bread, you're going to make a naturally leavened bread with fresh wheat. And hands down, it's going to get you the most nutritious bread. So that's what we're going to be up to. I'm going to move this out of the way here for a minute. All right, and so let's go through what you're going to need to do this at home. So the ingredients are going to be very, very simple today. I've got water and I have flour, and that's really all we're going to need to get started. We're going to add some salt to the mix later on when we make the bread, but to get the starter going, we're just using flour and water. And but I'm going to show you a couple other things that you may want to have if you're going to follow along. So one of these I think is really important is having a notebook. So when you're starting to bake, and I think the first loaves I ever made were probably when I was 16 years old or something, probably similar to Richard. It may have been at home, it may have been when I first went to college, I can't really remember. And I got a Laurel's Kitchen bread book, and I remember I was trying the recipes out of that book. And some of them didn't come out very well, some of them did. I think I ate all of them. I can't remember ever throwing away a loaf of bread. But keeping a notebook as you go, just at the start of each bread that you're making, put down the date, where you are when you're doing it, the time of day you're starting it, and take some notes on how cold is it humid or really dry, where are you holding the starter. Those kind of things can help you go back. If something turned out really, really well, which I hope happens for some of you, then you'll have some notes that can help guide you to what may have worked. If something turns out really badly, you've got some notes that can help you figure out what may have happened there. So this is a really simple thing, but have a little notebook journal that you can use to follow along with your bread journey. You can also have your recipes there. So as you find recipes you like, I hope your recipes you end up using at home aren't necessarily the identical recipes that we have here. You may adapt them a little bit, and you can have those written down for yourself. I'm going to show in some later shows some notebooks I have from my grandma's kitchen, and she wrote all sorts of recipes down. I think it used to be a very common practice when people used to cook at home a lot, and it's a really nice thing for us to get into. So that's the first thing I would have. Second is a scale. I talked about this in previous episodes. This is like a $15 scale. It's plastic. It's just a kitchen scale. It's a very, very simple scale, but you're going to need something like this because we're going to be weighing out our ingredients when we make the bread. It's really, really hard to do this accurately without a scale. So strongly recommend you have a scale if you want to follow along. Another piece of equipment I'm going to show you is a thermometer. This is a very inexpensive thermometer. You can adjust its set point here if you need to, just mechanically. This is about as cheap a thermometer as you can get, but it works great. And we can use this to look at the temperature of water that we're using, to look at the temperature of dough that we're using, and to look at the temperature of the bread on the interior once we cooked it. And all of those things can be helpful to us at various points along the way. So scale and thermometer, you really can't do this without the scale. You're just guessing. The thermometer is really, really helpful. Another thing I'm going to show you that I would recommend is we're going to be aiming at making a loaf, like a sandwich loaf. And I know that's not the it's not like the hip Instagrammable thing that's being done right now with bread. I think a lot of people, when they get started with bread, they're going for like a really beautiful bowl, sort of rounded loaf with a big, thick, crunchy crust. And we're going to be making something totally different than that. The methods I'm showing you can allow you to also make that kind of bread. But I feel like stuck at home, we make sandwiches for our kids, and right now we're not going out to buy bread. So having a bread that's sliceable, that can make a beautiful toast, that I can make a sandwich with, is really, really helpful and nutritious for my family. And so that's what we're going to be focused on. So having a loaf pan of some sort. Now, Richard told me this kind of loaf pan is not the best for making the bread. He thinks that a metal pan sticks less. And also, the metal pans, they cook better. But I don't have the metal pans. Maybe someday I'll get them. I just have this like standard sort of Pyrex meatloaf pan. One advantage to this when you're starting out, you can see in the side, you can see the bubbles forming, which is pretty nice information as you're starting to get the bread ready to bake. So those are some pieces of equipment. This is a little spray bottle. You could also have a cast iron pot. When you bake that bread, you're going to want to keep it moist in the oven when you first put the bread in. So there's one way you can do that is with a spray bottle like this, If you don't have a spray bottle, you could use a heavy cast iron pan or pot, something that you can pour boiling water into, and you put in the oven when you're getting the bread started. That's going to keep the crust moist enough that it's flexible. So as those bubbles are expanding in the first 10 minutes, you can get a really nice lift out of your bread. If you don't do that, you're not going to get a nice lofty loaf. So those are some pieces of equipment that I would encourage you to have. There's another thing we're going to use today. I've been grinding flour on the show, I think every single episode it feels like, and it's like, it's really loud and you can't hear me for like 2 minutes. I pre-ground this just before the episode today, but this is a grain grinder. I'll spend a little more time talking about this. This week's all about bread, and so some of the recipes are more involved and engaged, but things like today, this is actually when we get down to doing the cooking today, it's really, really simple. So you're gonna have to suffer through me talking a lot, but I think understanding some of what we're doing is gonna be really helpful. And I'll take a few minutes in a later show this week to talk about grinders. But this is a rye, this is a hard red winter wheat, and this is a soft white winter wheat. And these are the grains that I grind to make fresh flour, which is what I'll be using in the bread. Now, if you don't have a grain grinder, then you can get to a really beautiful fresh wheat by purchasing some. This is from Maine Grains. We work with them a lot at Clover. We love them. This is already a flour. I'll just open it up so you can see what's inside. And you can order these online, and we'll keep sharing with everybody the links. I love what these guys do. They're buying the wheat berries from farmers up in Maine and in the surrounding areas. And so you get a chance to support some really good activities with your dollar and bring some really beautiful nutrition into your household. So this is a great source of flour. They also sell wheat berries if you get yourself a grinder. There are other sources for those things too. So we're going to be making a recipe that uses half of the recipe is going to be made with this fresh ground wheat, and then half of the recipe is going to be made with this white flour. And that's a white bread flour. It's an organic bread flour from Milanese, which is what we use at Clover. It's a Canadian company that does really beautiful flours. But you can get organic bread flour from King Arthur and from other sources, Bob's Red Mill. And if you don't have access to an organic bread flour, you could use a regular bread flour or an organic all-purpose flour. Any of those things will work. The bread flour is going to be a little more glutinous and give you a little bit more springiness to the loaf that you're making, but you can make a really delicious loaf with any of those kinds of flours. So the flours and the water is what we're going to need for making the starter. I told you just now that I had done you all a favor by grinding that flour beforehand, but now I'm looking at that and realizing I haven't ground enough, so I'm going to have to turn that grinder on. Apologies. When I'm making the starter, I'm going to start out with my bowl on a scale like this, and I'm going to tare that scale to the weight of the bowl, and then I'm just going to build the starter right into it. I'll use the same method when I'm building the doughs and things like that. So once you get used to using that scale, it's actually really fast and really efficient. I'm going to erase this, and I'm going to take a second to write a recipe up here for you guys. So you can follow along at home. And what I'm hoping is that some of you will be watching this after this is aired, which is totally cool, and you could get started with this at any time and you could follow along with the shows. But this is going to be semi-real time, so we're starting this on a Monday at my house. We're going to have a starter that's ready to go by Thursday, and then we're going to have bread on Friday that we make from the starter we're starting today. So if you want to follow along, you're going to have some sort of a similar sequence to that at home. And so the steps we're going to use to make the bread. Step number 1 is going to be making a starter. Step number 2 is we're going to refresh the starter. And step number 3 is we're going to make a dough. So these are the steps we're going through this week. And we're going to have some sort of delicious ending there. So the starter today, what we're going to do is we're going to do 500 grams of whole wheat flour. We're going to do 500 grams of a white bread flour. So together that's going to be 1 kilo. We're going to add water to that. We're going to add 850 grams of water. So the way bakers talk about this kind of thing is they call that an 85% hydration. So the way you get there is you take the dry ingredients, 500 and 500, so we've got 1,000. So we've got 1,000 grams of dry. And then they apply a percentage to that. So in this case, we're aiming for what's called 85% hydration. So 85% of 1,000 is going to be 850 grams of water. Now, when bakers talk about hydration levels, they may say 40% hydration. That would be 400 grams of water for 1,000 dry. 70% hydration, 700 grams of water for 1,000 dry. And so this is how bakers think about the world. Now, what's very confusing to me as an engineer is the way I would think of percent hydration is I would think of the final mix, which in this case is 1,850 grams, and I would think of the percent hydration as the percent of the final mix that's water, which in this case is going to be like 44% or something, 45%. I'm just doing it in my head, but it's going to be something like that. But that's not what's meant by bakers. When bakers talk about hydration levels, they're talking about this, the percent against the dry. And the reason I think is like when you're building these doughs, it makes more sense, and we'll just be doing this right now, but you add in 500 and 500, you get to 1,000. Now you're trying to figure out how much water I need to add to that, and then you just apply your ratio, and that's the water you add. So that's what's meant when bakers talk about hydration levels. 85% is a very wet dough, but it's sort of a dry starter. So a lot of people make starters that are 100% hydration. So 1 part flour to 1 part water. This is a starter method that I was learning from Richard. I've been learning from Richard. I'm still exploring it. And he aims for 85% hydration for the starter, which is a little bit drier than the starters I've made before. When we get to the dough, to refreshing in dough, we're going to also have the same target, 85% hydration, which is more wet than flours I've made before as dough, or doughs I've made before. So it's interesting. The starter here is a little drier than what I've done before, and the dough we're going to make is going to be a little more wet than what I've done before. They're going to be at this 85% hydration number all the way through. And once you come to understand that, it's easy to scale this recipe. If you want to make 2 kilos of dough, you're going to have 2,000 grams of flour, and then you would need you'd need to have 85% of that in water. So you would need 1,600 grams of water. So you can scale it up and down once you understand how this math works. It's pretty simple arithmetic. I hope I'm not losing anybody here, but that's how we're thinking about this recipe. So this is the starter recipe. 500 grams of whole wheat, 500 grams of white, 850 grams of water. So I've got chalk on my hands. I'm going to wash that off, and I'm going to get the flour going here. So I need 500 grams of this, which is quite a lot. So sorry, I had intended to grind this before, but I'm realizing I didn't grind nearly enough. Alright, so we're in the noisy grinding part. Washing your hands is really, really important because you're going to be sticking your hands in that dough, and you'd like to make sure those hands are as clean as possible. So you want to wash them with water, you want to scrub them really well. You're going to do this before you make the dough. You're going to do this before you touch the dough, before you flip the dough, before you handle it every time. You're going to do a really good job washing your hands. And then while that's going, I'm going to go ahead and just get my white flour started. So we're just looking at the scale here. watching it, it's like 300, 400. I shot a little over. So I'm at 550. Now, I would say when you're doing this, it doesn't have to be perfect. If that's a little over, a little under, it's okay. We want to get close. Alright, and we're waiting for the grinder. This is what I was talking about. When I ground that earlier, I was thinking about the refreshing the starter. I wasn't thinking about starting with a whole new starter. So, we're still working through the grinder. My kids wake up to this in the morning when we're making pancakes and stuff. It's really loud. And I'll tell you a quick story if you can hear me at all. When I was a little boy, my dad had a hand mill, and he would make porridge and stuff in the mornings. So I would wake up in the morning to the same kind of sound, and he'd be grinding rice or other things to make porridge. It was a very familiar sound. So I'm going to hit the tear button now, and I'm going to start putting the fresh wheat in there. The fresh wheat comes out really warm and fluffy. So that's good. And now, so sorry about that racket. I really should do that before the show. But at least you get to see this all in live in real time. So it's nice and warm, it's fluffy. If I didn't have that, I could use this instead. And I've added in the flours now. I tear the scale. So the scale says 0. And so what I need to do now is add in 850 grams of water. So we're getting... There we go, 848. There we go, 852. So that's great. And now I'm going to take this off the scale. And I've got water and I've got flour in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mix the two. And it's a little goopy right now, so I'm going to start out by mixing this with my spoon. Now, this method of making starter is a little different than starter I've made in the past. So this is this method I learned from Richard, and I hadn't done starter like this before. I've been getting some really beautiful breads, and Richard has a rationale for this. So the other starters I made in the past, I made a smaller amount, and I've thrown out bits of it every day as I feed that starter. This is a different approach. What we're doing is making a much larger starter at the beginning. And then we're going to let this just sit. So we're not going to do that feeding. We're not going to throw stuff out. We're going to let this sit for a few days. And Richard's thought about it is that if you give it enough food, there's enough, as he describes it, there's a party going on in there. And we've got like plenty to keep people at the party, so no one gets lost and leaves the party, and people don't give up on it. And so his thought basically is that if you run out of food as you're trying to make your starter, then you might have a shift in your population of bacteria and yeast that gets you to a place you don't want to be. And what I'm doing when I'm reaching over there is I'm just making my hands, I'm washing them off and I'm making them wet. That's just keeping me from getting too sticky in the dough. And I'm just mixing this all together. And so you can see it there. So I'm just making sure this is all very thoroughly mixed. So this is a dough, sort of as though we were making a bread. And this is when we make bread later this week. You'll see it's going to start out with this sort of consistency. This is at 85% hydration. And so it's a pretty wet dough. But we're just going to let this sit in the kitchen now. So that's just going to sit open like that. I can put a little towel over it. In my kitchen, it's been pretty dry lately at night. It's been so stinking cold. And so I'll put a little towel over it probably. You can see like these right here. I'll probably just set it over here in my kitchen. And I'll put a little kitchen towel over it. Got one with farm animals on it. And we'll just let that sit there. And we're going to check in on it tomorrow. And tomorrow morning, I'll show you what it might look like. So this is what I put together. This was 2 days ago. So this was exactly like that when I put it together. And this was 2 days ago. And you can see now, you can see the bubbles forming in there. And you can see the consistency's really changed a lot to the point where I can even pick it up and flip it around. And it's like stretchy. So the gluten is forming a different kind of network than what we had when we first mixed it. And I know this looks like this has nothing to do with what we just made, but this is exactly the same flour, exactly the same ratios, and this is just sat for 2 days. And if I taste it, I'll get a little piece of this. It's got like a pleasant sort of lemony sourness to it. It doesn't have any salt in it right now, but it does have like a nice little sourness. And there's some nice bubbles being formed. And that's what we're going to aim for. And so in 2 or 3 days, this is going to be ready to be the starting point for a new bread. And that's all we're going to go through today. Oh, I thought I'd show you. Blue made his first bread. He made his first bread yesterday, and he had a really beautiful result. Actually, what happened with these, and I wanted to show you this because you may have some of these kinds of results at home. So this one is the one I wanted to show. This is what we're going to be aiming at toward the end of the week. And this loaf, there's not much of it left, even though it just came out of the oven a couple hours ago because it's so delicious. The kids have been like grabbing at it and eating it. But you can see it's like spongy and bouncy, and it has like a really beautiful flexibility to it. It smells, I'd say, like honey. It smells amazing. And it tastes incredible. So it has a bit of a crust, but not too much of a crust. And that one, what happened is we would have baked it last night, but it wasn't quite ready. It was going a little slower than we expected. I think it was cold outside. So we let it go overnight, and I put it in my basement to try to retard it. But it just blew out anyway. It was going nuts. So by this morning, it was all over the place. So we gathered it up and put it back together to bake it. We did that with 2 loaves, and this was the second loaf. The first loaf, I put it into a very hot oven, 500 degree oven, and let it be in the 500 degree oven for 10 minutes, and then I brought the temperature down, and I got really nice loft out of the bread. This one is its cousin, is the exact same dough. I just started this at a lower temperature, so the oven on this one was at like 350 at the start, and it didn't go, I didn't bring it higher than that. So you can see, it's still like a very spongy and beautiful bread. It's going to be very edible. It's going to be beautiful toast, but it doesn't have that beautiful appearance the other one. The only difference of these two is the temperature of the oven when I put it in. And I just think it's a nice example for you to see. You may have a little bit of a range of outcomes, and we'll talk a little bit about what leads to what, and we'll play around. It's all going to be edible. And my big focus here is I just love people to not be scared to get into the kitchen and to play around with some of this stuff. Have fun with it. Embrace your mistakes if you make them. Everything's going to be delicious, and we're going to have a lot of fun making bread together this week. So we'll be back tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Thanks, everybody.